mentioned Freud, and most people are familiar with the Freudian idea that the denial of sexuality can lead to distortions in personality and various sorts of symptoms. But as an existentialist, I gather that you believe that the denial of death can also lead to neurotic distortions. Is that right?
Exactly. I think it's. I think I'm using Freud's structure of the mind and saying, well, we repress this. It's there. It's in our unconscious. It comes out in dreams all the time, and it's quite remarkable that if a therapist, if I am attuned to these issues, I see it very frequently in therapy. Therapists who haven't had that particular point of view or are quite young or haven't dealt with some of their own concerns, well, they say it just never arises in my therapy. But not only that, I think that it follows somewhat the course of Freud's life era, in that I think that we have a sort of life developmental history in which we first deal with death when we first discover it, and often this is much earlier than we sometimes think. Children have some glimmerings of seeing dead leaves and dead insects, and then dead pets, or maybe even the death of a grandparent or a funeral, and gradually it begins to begin, and then parents do whatever they can for a young child to reassure them. Sometimes they try to change the subject. Sometimes they offer visions of everlasting life or reunion in heaven. But then it goes underground in the same way Freud talked about. We have he called the sexual latency period, periods of about 6-7 years old to adolescence. And I think the same thing happens with death anxiety. We forget about it. It goes underground. Mm-hmm. And then it really comes out in adolescence again. Adolescents are very aware of this and concerned about this. And we see a lot of efforts to deal with, sometimes in what we call counterphobic. We do exactly the opposite of what we're frightened of. So you see adolescents going to horror films or taunting death with songs, and of course all the Halloween kind of revelry. And then, when we get to finish high school and finish our education, at that point, it goes underground again for a long time, because we become totally preoccupied with the two major tasks of adulthood, which is, beginning to create your own family and your own professional career. And then it's underground for a long time until it makes its emergence again in what we have learned to call the midlife crisis. In our 40s, and we seem to reach the peak and begin to look at life in a different way at that point.
Why is it that people fear death so much, do you think?
Well, one of the questions I often ask patients who are dealing with this, I'll ask them, I say to them, look, I know this feels like a stupid question or a simplistic question, but let me ask you, what is it precisely about death that really frightens you so much? And it's quite remarkable that people come with very different answers. So, you really have to look at individual particular variations. Some people have a great fear of death, for example, because they feel that they've not really lived, that there's too much of life that's been unlived. And there is a rough correlation. There's some research to indicate this too, that the greater the amount of perception of unlived life in you, the greater the degree of death anxiety or death panic, I would even say. I always loved that phrase from the Greek writer Kazantzakis, who wrote Zorba the Greek. And Kazantzakis used to say that his goal was to leave death nothing but a burned-out castle, so that you live life very fully. And I have a sense that if you live life very fully, that there's less panic at the end of life. So that's one, it's just one. And there are many others. The idea of leaving a concern about your children. Some people will say that. How will the children cope with my death, all the pain that will cause by them? The aching about not seeing the end of the stories, not seeing about how your children will end up. And of course, if people have certain kind of strong supernatural, superstitious views about death, and they fear hell, or they feel everlasting torment, then of course the fear of death can be compounded and take even greater meaning. And that was very true for many centuries of Western civilization, when you know all the paintings of the Last Judgment, so death had another new whole dimension of fear in that way. In my view, tend to deny the presence of death. So you're dealing with a whole different kind of phenomena. I'm writing this book as though death is permanent, death is finite, and we have to deal with the whole sense of personal finiteness.
Well, at the same time that I was reading your book, I've also been reading a book about near-death experience, and it's a collection of vignettes, much as yours has many wonderful vignettes and stories, and feel free to throw any of those in as we go along in our conversation. But this particular book is full of vignettes about people who had a white light experience and felt strongly that they had a taste of what's beyond. What's your take on those kinds of accounts? I'm sure you must have read those
I think
somewhere.
It's pure illusion. I think a good deal more, a technical input in that people with certain kind of brain states, especially lack of oxygen, will undergo these. So it's a purely physiological kind of experience that happens to us, and we wrap it up, filling a gestalt with our own kind of illusion. But I know that's had a great deal of press recently, but again, I see scientific articles written all the time about how this can be experimentally recreated when there's nowhere near death. And I'm not familiar with all the brain literature, but there is quite a tremendous amount of it recently. There's a long tradition through so many centuries of the fact that life and death are interdependent, that Socrates would say that preparing for death is something that will enhance your life. That's our task in life. This observation came really strongly home to me for when I worked some years ago. I worked for about 10 years with people who are dying of cancer, as a way of learning about this area, because you can't often, with your everyday clients, work in these areas because people deny that so much. But I thought I will work with a group of people who can't deny it, who are facing more immediate death through a lethal illness. So I worked with people like that, and I began to form groups, and these were the first therapy groups that had been done for people with cancer. I was working heavily because of the research that I was doing with women with breast cancer. And one of the things that astounded me after a while was that I found that there was a substantial number of my patients that I worked with, I'm talking a lot, maybe 30 to 40%, who didn't necessarily succumb to numbness and despair, but actually began to change and live life more fully. I mean, they did things like changing their life priorities. So one of them put it, trivializing the trivia in life. Ceasing to be so concerned about tiny little things, about not so concerned about interpersonal rejection, began to look at what was truly important, their family and the love of those closest to them and the changing seasons. So they began to live life more fully at that point. So that's what I mean, you can change the way that you love. And the corollary of that is, well, then maybe you don't have to be actually facing immediate death. Maybe by getting in touch with the death that is in all of us, we can approach life in a different way. I think what we can do is maybe we could treasure life a little bit more. Maybe we could find life more poignant, more of greater impact for us if we realize, in fact, our life is finite.
Yes.
So that's what I mean by that.